Welcome to Baruch Menashe's podcast. This is a space for rigorous exploration of human development, psychology, and social interactivity. Each episode examines the underlying structures of thought, behavior, and interaction, offering insights drawn from education, research, and philosophical reflection. Here we engage deeply with ideas, question assumptions, and illuminate the patterns that shape both individual growth and collective experience. Join me as we unpack complex concepts and translate them into understanding, perspective, and meaningful dialogue. To gain the advantage of the ritualistic sense, that is, to participate in the applicability of a social concurrent that is notwithstanding of social discourse. It behooves one to become engaged, not via its social sentiment, since the intentionality towards the acquisition is of such degree that the acquisition will finally become that very intention if one intends to access a social sentiment via the social sentiment, its proclamation, its proximity of discourse, then they are not going to apply its finale only via that social process to gain the final access in which it becomes traditionally imprinted, ritualistically emboldened, then it must be through a different concurrency of intention. The intention will dictate in what way it becomes accessed. And if the intention is of a certain disposition which allows for closure towards the sentiment, irrespective of its social process, then we begin to gain certain acquisition. In a sense, social sentiment and all its acquisition is never laden as the fundamental state of the psyche, but rather its more prevalent consciousness associations. Of course, this brings the question of in what arena does consciousness lay and what arena does it not enter, and also the question of abstraction and how abstraction is itself a disposition of the psyche rather than its latent state of existence. But suffice to say for this discussion that it is not the wholeness of being, yet we cannot describe in what way it is different than the wholeness of being. It is surfaced on top. It's reliant upon a psychic process, whether by use of the brain or otherwise. And those are distinct parameters which do not reach every crevice of one's biological standing. That is not the biological as a scientific aspect, but that is another conceptual framework in the plethora of consciousness, but rather biological in the sense of all inclusion, notwithstanding any aspect that is possible to be included. The ritualistic sense would thus be only appropriated through an approach that is not social, an approach that doesn't concur with a social discourse. And for a stronger understanding of this, in which it wouldn't be articulated in social discourse, it could not be imagined to be something that would come up in conversation. It wouldn't have the aspects that would concur as dialogical in its sense. This is why even when we discuss specific ritualistic senses, we are doing so as a social sentiment and not as an articulation of that experience, as that acquisition. And because of this, the prevalence of assuming one over the other is commonplace. Instead, the approach of the ritualistic sense is through application of being towards its process, irrespective of and how that process articulates itself. It is also why the family body is most prevalent, be enabled as a ritualistic sense, because one participates not because of any social meaning, but rather because they are embedded in that framework by virtue of their existence. We could say one is naturally endowed with already an approach to experience, to external phenomenon, irrespective of social discourse, that of the original family body, which in all beings will be in some level an acquisition of mere fact of natural participation without a original intent of social participation. There is no discourse that begins this stage of familial participation. It is despite such. Then the question becomes, what is the modality that enables the acquisition if it is not social? We could say it is existential, that one is in view of themselves in respect to the familial body, and in view of the familial body in respect to themselves. They've simply denoted something more than themselves to be as they are, as the ancients with the blood bonds and other such sentiment that proves that it is concerning of the existential experience itself. But it is not necessarily such. It can be simply the participation from another modality other than the familial body. It is possible to be simply the happenstance of experience, so that we don't have to stretch our limits of theoretical discourse to include existential phenomena. One is beholden to a state that does not contain nor does not initiate through social discourse, and is now within that state to acquiesce to all its phenomena. The position of individual via that phenomenon that is not social is not necessarily existential, but more so abled by positioned experience. One might find it as an anomaly that the ritualistic sense, or the appropriation of material irrespective of social discourse, is found to be of some discursive sentiment. This is not because it is truly a process of discourse, or merely that it supposes itself after the fact of its discursive sentiment based on the appropriation of material. We can imagine the family body to be filled with discursive sentiment, but are merely the aftercharge of the already obtained material irrespective of social extension. They are merely discussing the perpendicular experience that has been found through adaptability of material, and are not exchanging in a dialogical manner. And if we follow the transcript of the initial process of the family body, it is not necessarily logical in its formation, but merely following the material in each of its paralleled experiences. That is merely the validation of that process. It's the acceptance of the experience so that others are the manifestation of such in a discursive manner, but are not required as a discursive sentiment to reach that supposition. To return to the topic at hand, the appropriation of the material through acquisition of perpendicular nature, irrespective of social discourse, is through a psychological arena that is on one side not existential, for then a single being in an inclusion of other beings is not distinguished in their compartmentalization of each other. As well, it is not something social. So what is that middle ground? And we find that it's the process of the psyche itself. We find that it is perceptually oriented, with a distinguishment of individuality based on the beholden nature of each perceptual arena. It is not that one becomes unified singularly with the external phenomenon, because then it would lose its discursive advantage, not in the sense of a social advantage, but a experience that can be noted as an experience, something distinguished from regular phenomenon. The ability to do such is to have an arena that allows for the information to come in distinguished from individuality at some level, and in that way flows the traffic of that material. The discursive element that comes after the fact allows for the notability and how there is a distinguishing factor. There is a social articulation, not a social process, but articulation of that exemplification, being that the perceptual arena is a distinguished parameter of the psyche that moves in and out of the psyche habituation. It is the discursive element of the physiological experience of perceptual adaptation. Now, if one wants to call this social discourse, they can, but it is not social in the sense of a subjectivity of psyche process that has mended and folded into the material itself. There is no subjectivity in the case of the scenario. And we could find in the transcript of the initial family body that very exemplification, in that they are seeking the validation of and how they have externally objectified that perceptual experience, so similar that each could validate each other. If it was some sort of subjectivity, then different beings would have such different analysis of experience, like the validating process would not take effect. It is only the distinguishing factor that sets it very approximating, that will provide both similarity for validation and distinguishingness for the strangeness that's required of validation. One cannot validate from the vantage of the initial point because it is too similar, it is too alike. And in this way, we finally get the result of a discursive process of perceptual material.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.